Dark Night of the Soul. By St. John the Cross. Book 1. Chapter 9. Signs for discerning whether a spiritual person is treading the path of this sensory night, and purgation. 1. Because these aridities may not proceed from the sensory night and purgation, but from sin and imperfection, or weakness and lukewarmness, or some bad humor or bodily indisposition, I will give some signs here for discerning whether the dryness is the result of this purgation, or of one of these other defects. I find there are 3 principal signs for knowing this. 2. The first is that since these souls do not get satisfaction or consolation from the things of God, they do not get any from creatures either. Since God puts a soul in this dark night, in order to dry up and purge its sensory appetite, He does not allow it to find sweetness, or delight in anything. Through this sign it can in all likelihood be inferred, that this dryness and distaste is not the outcome of newly committed sins and imperfections. If this were so, some inclination or propensity to look for satisfaction in something other than the things of God would be felt in the sensory part, for when the appetite is allowed indulgence in some imperfection, the soul immediately feels an inclination toward it, little or great, in proportion to the degree of its satisfaction and attachment. Yet, because the want of satisfaction in earthly or heavenly things could be the product of some indisposition, or melancholic humor, which frequently prevents one from being satisfied with anything, the second sign or condition is necessary. 3. The second sign for the discernment of this purgation is that the memory ordinarily turns to God solicitously, and with painful care, and the soul thinks it is not serving God, but turning back, because it is aware of this distaste for the things of God. Hence it is obvious that this aversion and dryness is not the fruit of laxity and tepidity, for lukewarm people do not care much for the things of God, nor are they inwardly solicitous about them. There is consequently a notable difference between dryness and lukewarmness. The lukewarm are very lax and remiss in their will and spirit, and have no solicitude about serving God. Those suffering from the purgative dryness are ordinarily solicitous, concerned, and pained about not serving God. Even though the dryness may be furthered by melancholia, or some other humor, as it often is, it does not thereby fail to produce its purgative effect in the appetite, for the soul will be deprived of every satisfaction and concerned only about God. If this humor is the entire cause, everything ends in displeasure, and does harm to one's nature, and there are none of these desires to serve God that accompany the purgative dryness. Even though, in this purgative dryness, the sensory part of the soul is very cast down, slack, and feeble in its actions, because of the little satisfaction it finds, the spirit is ready and strong. 4. The reason for this dryness is that God transfers His goods and strength from sense to spirit. Since the sensory part of the soul is incapable of the goods of spirit, it remains deprived, dry, and empty. Thus, while the spirit is tasting, the flesh tastes nothing at all, and becomes weak in its work. But through this nourishment, the spirit grows stronger and more alert, and becomes more solicitous than before, about not failing God. If in the beginning, the soul does not experience this spiritual savor and delight, but dryness and distaste, the reason is the novelty involved in this exchange. Since its palate is accustomed to these other sensory tastes, the soul still sets its eyes on them. And since, also, its spiritual palate is neither purged nor accommodated for so subtle a taste, it is unable to experience the spiritual savor and good, until gradually prepared by means of this dark and obscure night. The soul instead experiences dryness and distaste, because of a lack of the gratification it formerly enjoyed so readily. 5. Those whom God begins to lead into these desert solitudes are like the children of Israel. When God began giving them the heavenly food, which contained in itself all savors, and changed to whatever taste each one hungered after, as is there mentioned, they nonetheless felt a craving for the tastes of the flesh meats and onions they had eaten in Egypt, for their palate was accustomed and attracted to them, more than to the delicate sweetness of the angelic manna. And in the midst of that heavenly food, they wept and sighed for flesh meat. The baseness of our appetite is such, that it makes us long for our own miserable goods and feel aversion for the incommunicable heavenly good. 6. Yet, as I say, when these aridities are the outcome of the purgative way of the sensory appetite, the spirit feels the strength and energy to work, which is obtained from the substance of that interior food, even though in the beginning, it may not experience the savor, for the reason just mentioned. This food is the beginning of a contemplation that is dark and dry to the senses. Ordinarily, this contemplation which is secret and hidden from the very one who receives it, imparts to the soul, together with the dryness and emptiness it produces in the senses, an inclination to remain alone and in quietude. And the soul will be unable to dwell on any particular thought, nor will it have the desire to do so. If those in whom this occurs know how to remain quiet, without care or solicitude about any interior or exterior work, they will soon in that unconcern and idleness, delicately experience the interior nourishment. This refection is so delicate, that usually if the soul desires, or tries to experience it, it cannot do so. For, as I say, this contemplation is active, while the soul is in idleness and unconcern. It is like air that escapes when one tries to grasp it in one's hand. 7. In this sense, we can interpret what the spouse said to the bride, in the Song of Songs, "Turn your eyes from me, because they make me fly away." God conducts the soul along so different a path, and so puts it in this state, that a desire to work with the faculties would hinder, rather than help his work, whereas in the beginning of the spiritual life, everything was quite the contrary. The reason is that now in this state of contemplation, when the soul leaves discursive meditation and enters the state of proficience, it is God who works in it. He therefore binds the interior faculties, and leaves no support in the intellect, nor satisfaction in the will, nor remembrance in the memory. At this time, a person's own efforts are of no avail, but are an obstacle to the interior peace and work God is producing in the spirit, through that dryness of sense. Since this peace is something spiritual and delicate, its fruit is quiet, delicate, solitary, satisfying, and peaceful, and far removed from all the other gratifications of beginners, which are very palpable and sensory. This is the peace that David says God speaks in the soul, in order to make it spiritual, Psalm 85:8. The third sign follows from this one. 8. The third sign for the discernment of this purgation of the senses, is the powerlessness, in spite of one's efforts, to meditate and make use of the imagination, the interior sense, as was one's previous custom. At this time God does not communicate himself through the senses, as he did before, by means of the discursive analysis and synthesis of ideas, but begins to communicate himself through pure spirit, by an act of simple contemplation, in which there is no discursive succession of thought. The exterior and interior senses of the lower part of the soul cannot attain to this contemplation. As a result, the imaginative power and fantasy can no longer rest in any consideration or find support in it. 9. From the third sign, it can be deduced that this dissatisfaction of the faculties is not the fruit of any bad humor. If it were, people would be able, with a little care, to return to their former exercises, and find support for their faculties, when that humor passed away, for it is by its nature changeable. In the purgation of the appetite, this return is not possible, because on entering it the powerlessness to meditate always continues. It is true, though, that at times in the beginning the purgation of some souls is not continuous in such a way, that they are always deprived of sensory satisfaction, and the ability to meditate. Perhaps, because of their weakness, they cannot be weaned all at once. Nevertheless, if they are to advance, they will ever enter further into the purgation, and leave further behind their work of the senses. Those who do not walk the road of contemplation, act very differently. This night of the aridity of the senses, is not so continuous in them, for sometimes they experience the aridities, and at other times not, and sometimes they can meditate, and at other times they cannot. God places them in this night, solely to exercise and humble them, and reform their appetite, lest in their spiritual life, they foster a harmful attraction towards sweetness. But he does not do so, in order to lead them to the life of the Spirit, which is contemplation. For God does not bring to contemplation all those who purposely exercise themselves in the way of the Spirit, nor even half. Why? He best knows. As a result, he never completely weans their senses from the breasts of considerations and discursive meditations, except for some short periods and at certain seasons, as we said. Next video, Chapter 10. Thanks.